Welcome to this journey through one of the most unsettling cases in American history. Today we will delve into the shadows of Virginia's Appalachian mountains, where in 1881 something sinister occurred to a man named Isaac Pennington. Before we begin, leave in the comments where you are watching from right now. Is anyone following this story from the cold mountain lands or the heat of the coast? The Appalachian mountains have always kept secrets. These ancient mountains, with their deep valleys and dense forests, have witnessed generations of stories that were never fully told. By the end of the 19th century, the Virginia region was a place where progress arrived slowly. Communities lived in isolation, depending on each other to survive the harsh winters and sweltering summers. The roads were dirt paths, cutting through cliffs and valleys, where the morning mist could hide anything. Isaac Pennington was known in his community as a hard-working man. By the age of 43, he had built a modest life in nearby Giles County, a mountainous area where families farmed small plots and raised livestock. Isaac wasn't rich, but he had the respect of his neighbors. He was a quiet man of few words, who preferred the company of his tools and his land to idle chatter in church on Sundays. The spring of 1881 arrived late that year. The last snows of March still covered the highest peaks when April finally brought the thaw. It was during this time that Isaac mentioned to some neighbors that he would need to go on a trip. He had business to settle on a distant estate, something related to an inheritance from a deceased uncle. The details were vague, as was common in those times when privacy was valued above curiosity. On the morning of April 23rd, Isaac set off. He carried with him a small leather suitcase, a few coins kept in a tied handkerchief, and provisions for 3 days of walking. The journey he planned would take him along some of the most remote trails in Appalachia, crossing valleys where only hunters and lumberjacks occasionally ventured. No one questioned his decision to go alone. It was common for men from the region to make these solitary journeys, relying on their knowledge of the mountains and the hospitality of strangers along the way. The first 2 days passed normally, as far as is known. Isaac was seen by a farmer near the New River, carrying his suitcase and walking with a steady pace in a westerly direction. He waved, exchanged a few words about the weather, and moved on. That was the last time anyone saw him alive, walking of his own volition in the bright light of day. What happened next remains shrouded in shadow. The mountains kept their secrets for weeks as Isaac's family began to worry. When he didn't return on the expected date, his wife Martha reached out to the neighbors. Initially, everyone tried to calm her. Delays were common on such trips. A storm, a blocked path, an engagement that took longer than anticipated. But when 1 week turned into 2 and 2 into 3, worry gave way to fear. A search party was organized in early May. 12 men from the community, some on horseback, others on foot, set out following the route Isaac would have taken. They scoured the main trails, asked at every secluded cabin, at every stall along the way. No one had any news. It was as if Isaac Pennington had simply vanished into the thin mountain air. The forests of Appalachia are vast and unforgiving. Back then, before detailed maps and modern technology, a lost man could be just a few miles from home and never be found. The trees grew so thick that sunlight barely touched the ground. Deep ravines cut through the landscape, some so steep that descent was easy, but climbing back up was impossible. Bears, wolves, and the wilderness itself posed constant dangers to those who strayed from the beaten path. But there was something more to this story, something the searchers began to feel as they entered the most remote regions. They found strange signs, marks on trees that didn't look natural, remains of campfires in places where no one should have camped. And then, in a hidden clearing almost 20 kilometers from where Isaac was last seen, they made a discovery that would change everything. Isaac's suitcase was there, half buried under leaves and branches, as if someone had tried to hide it in a hurry. When they opened it, his clothes were still inside, neatly folded. But the coins were gone, and there were dark spots on the fabric, stains that looked like they had been washed, but still left traces of what they might have been. The men looked at each other in silence. Everyone understood this was not a simple disappearance. Something terrible had happened to Isaac Pennington in those gloomy mountains. The discovery of the suitcase turned a worried search into a grim investigation. The men who found it carried the object back to Giles County as if it were a cursed relic. Martha Pennington collapsed when she saw her husband's clothes, still folded with the care she had taught him years before. But it was those dark spots, those traces that no one wanted to name aloud, that transformed hope into painful certainty. The county sheriff, a man named Thomas Caldwell, took charge of the situation. Caldwell was 56 years old and had served as sheriff for over a decade. He knew the mountains, he knew the people who lived in them, and he also knew the secrets those lands could hide. It wasn't the first time someone had disappeared in Appalachia, but there was something different about this case. The abandoned suitcase, the stolen coins, those suspicious stains, everything pointed to something other than an accident, or a man simply getting lost. Caldwell assembled a larger group, 15 men this time, and returned to the spot where the suitcase had been found. They searched every inch of that clearing and the surrounding area. The forest there was dense, with centuries-old oak trees, whose canopies blocked almost all sunlight. The ground was covered with a thick layer of leaves accumulated over years, perhaps decades. It was the kind of place where nature quickly erased any trace left by man. But the searchers were persistent. They dug around the area where the suitcase was hidden. They looked for belongings, for signs of a struggle, for anything that could tell the story of what happened there. And then, about 30 yards from the clearing, one of the men found something disturbing. It was a torn piece of fabric caught in a thorny bush. The fabric matched exactly the shirt that Martha confirmed belonged to Isaac. It was torn violently, as if ripped off during a desperate struggle. From that point on, the search intensified. The men followed a barely visible trail that led even deeper into the forest, down a steep ravine where the sound of a stream echoed between the rocks. The descent was treacherous, and more than one man slipped on the damp, moss-covered stones. Down below, where the water ran clear over smooth rocks, they found more evidence. Footprints in the mud on the bank, already half erased by recent rains, but still visible. And next to them, drag marks, as if something heavy had been pulled across the damp earth. The men followed these marks downstream for nearly 2 kilometers. The forest there was even darker, a place where even the birds seemed to avoid singing. The trees curved over the stream, forming a natural tunnel, and the water, that had previously run clear, began to turn cloudy as they advanced. It was at a bend in the river, where the waters formed a small backwater, surrounded by large, ancient stones, that they made the discovery everyone feared, and, at the same time expected. Isaac Pennington was there, or rather, what was left of him was there, partially submerged in the cold, dark water. His body had been trapped between the stones, probably placed there on purpose, and the current had held it in place for all those weeks. The icy mountain water had preserved it enough that there was no doubt about his identity. Martha would later confirm it via an old scar on his left arm and a wedding ring that was still on his finger. But it was the condition of the body that revealed the true nature of the horror. Even with decomposition and the work of time, it was possible to see that Isaac had not died from natural causes. There were wounds, marks that suggested extreme violence. The county doctor, Dr. Samuel Harrison, was called to examine the body. His findings were laid out days later in a formal report that would shock the entire Giles County community. Dr. Harrison determined that Isaac Pennington had suffered multiple injuries from a sharp object, probably a large knife or a type of heavy blade. The wounds were deep and had been inflicted with considerable force. Furthermore, there were signs that Isaac had tried to defend himself. His arms showed defensive cuts, the kind of wound a person receives when trying to block an attacker's blows. Death had been neither quick nor painless. Isaac Pennington had fought for his life in those lonely mountains. The news spread quickly throughout the region. A murder, not an accident, not a misfortune, but a deliberate act of violence, and even worse, a robbery. The coins Isaac was carrying were gone, making the crime not only brutal, but premeditated. Someone knew Isaac was traveling with money. Someone followed him to that remote place. Someone attacked him, took his savings, hid his suitcase, and tried to make sure the body was never found. But who? That was the question that plagued Sheriff Caldwell and the entire community. The Appalachian Mountains were home to all kinds of people. Honest families, certainly, but also men who lived on the fringes of society. Solitary hunters who spent months in the forests. Fugitives who sought refuge in the mountains, where the law had difficulty reaching. Thieves who knew every hidden trail and every cave where a man could hide for years without being found. Caldwell began asking questions. He visited every hut, every logging camp, every secluded tavern within a 50-mile radius. Who was in the mountains in April? Who had seen Isaac? Who could have known he carried money? The answers came slowly, mixed with rumors, speculations, and the silence characteristic of people who lived in places where asking too many questions could be dangerous. One name began to come up repeatedly in whispered conversations. Elijah Cobb, a 38-year-old man known in the region for his violent nature and petty crimes. Cobb lived alone in a rundown cabin in the mountains, surviving on hunting and odd jobs. He had a history of fights in taverns, threatening neighbors, and had spent 6 months in a county jail years earlier for robbery. More importantly, Cobb had been seen in the vicinity of the trail Isaac would have used, precisely at the time of the disappearance. Elijah Cobb was the kind of man the mountains seemed to have shaped for their own dark purposes. Tall, thin, with sunken eyes that rarely met another person's gaze. He had arrived in Giles County years earlier, coming from somewhere no one could determine for sure. Some said he was from North Carolina. Others swore they had seen him before in Tennessee. The truth was that Cobb seemed to have no roots, no family, no past worth mentioning. He was simply there, living on the margins of civilized society. Cobb's cabin was nearly 15 miles from the site where Isaac's body was found, hidden in a narrow valley where the sun only reached the ground for a few hours at noon. It was a precarious structure made of ill-fitting logs and covered with a plank roof that leaked in multiple places. Around the hut, the remains of hunted animals were piled unceremoniously. Time-bleached bones mixed with rusty tools and empty bottles of cheap whiskey. It was the kind of place people avoided, where even stray dogs hesitated to enter. Sheriff Caldwell knew he needed more than rumors and suspicions to take action against Cobb. The law, even in those remote lands, required evidence, but there was something that bothered him deeply. Cobb had disappeared from sight for nearly 2 weeks in April, just around the time Isaac Pennington was killed. When he finally reappeared at the local tavern in early May, he had money to spend. Silver coins he made a point of showing off, buying drinks, and boasting about a well-paid job he claimed to have done for a distant farmer. Caldwell decided to visit Cobb. He took with him 2 deputies, experienced men who knew the dangers of confronting someone like Elijah deep in the mountains. They set out on a gray June morning when the mist still covered the valleys and made everything around them ghostly and unreal. The ride to the hut took nearly 3 hours, following trails that looked more like open scars on the mountainside. When they arrived, they found Cobb sitting outside his cabin, sharpening a large knife on a wet stone. The metallic sound echoed through the silent valley. He didn't seem surprised to see the lawman. He only looked up briefly, then turned his attention back to the blade gleaming under his calloused fingers. It was a hunting knife, the kind that could skin a deer, or, as everyone there thought simultaneously, inflict terrible wounds on a man. Caldwell dismounted and walked towards Cobb with the caution of someone approaching a wild animal. He asked direct questions. Where had Cobb been in April? Where did the money he spent in the tavern come from? Did he know Isaac Pennington? Had he been in that region of the mountains where the body was found? Cobb replied in the slurred voice characteristic of mountain men, each word coming out slowly like cold molasses. He claimed to have been hunting all through April, alone in the higher regions. As for the money, he said he had sold bearskins to a passing merchant, a man he couldn't properly describe, and whose name he couldn't remember. Of Isaac Pennington, he claimed to have never heard until news of the murder began to circulate. And as for the region where the body was found, he swore he rarely went there, preferring to hunt in the northern valleys. They were answers that were too convenient, too empty. Caldwell could feel the lie in the air, as he could feel a storm coming, but he had no proof. There were no witnesses. He had nothing but suspicion and the bad reputation of a man already marginalized by the community. He asked permission to search the cabin, and Cobb, with a crooked smile that didn't reach his eyes, nodded affirmatively. He had nothing to hide, he said. They could look as they pleased. The cabin was a miserable place, a single dark room with a bed made of twigs and straw, a crude table, and a rusty iron stove. Animal skins covered part of the floor and hung from the walls. The smell of decaying flesh and old smoke was almost unbearable. Caldwell and his deputies scoured every corner. They searched for blood-stained clothes. They searched for Isaac's coins. They searched for anything that might link Cobb to the crime. They found knives, several of them, all with very sharp blades and handles worn from use. They found some loose coins in a rusty tin, but nothing that could be definitively identified as belonging to Isaac. They found dirty and torn clothes, but they all looked like they had been used for hunting, stained with animal blood and old mud. There was nothing conclusive, nothing that could be presented as evidence in a court of law. Frustrated, but not defeated, Caldwell decided to press in another way. He began to interrogate people who had any relationship with Cobb, however tenuous, the owner of the tavern where he had spent that money. The hunters who occasionally crossed paths with him on the trails, even an old hermit who lived a few miles away, and sometimes exchanged provisions with Cobb. Each conversation added a piece to the puzzle, but the full picture remained unclear. The tavern owner, a stout man named William Fletcher, remembered well the night Cobb showed up with money. It was unusual, Fletcher said. Cobb usually drank on credit or paid with skins and jerky. But that night he had silver coins, several of them, and he was in a strangely cheerful mood. He drank a lot, spoke loudly, which was not his custom. And when someone asked where the sudden luck had come from, Cobb suddenly fell silent, paid his bill, and went out into the darkness of the night. A hunter named Joseph Mercer had something more interesting to report. He had crossed paths with Cobb in the mountains in late April, a few days after what would have been the likely date of Isaac's death. Cobb was coming from a direction that would take him directly from the region where the body was found. He carried a heavy backpack on his back and seemed anxious, constantly looking back as if expecting to be followed. When Mercer greeted him, as was customary among mountain men, Cobb barely answered and quickened his pace, disappearing quickly among the trees. But perhaps the most disturbing information came from the old hermit, a 70-year-old man named Amos Wright, who had lived alone for decades in a natural cave in the mountains. Wright had a reputation for being a bit crazy, but also for having an astonishing memory and eyes that didn't miss anything that happened in his territory. He told the sheriff that he had seen Cobb in late April washing something in the creek near his cave. It was clothing, Wright said, and the surrounding water turned dark as Cobb rubbed the fabric with almost desperate fury. Caldwell asked Wright if he was sure of what he had seen. The old hermit looked at him with clear eyes and replied that he had lived too long in those mountains to mistake muddy water for bloody water. He knew the difference, and he was sure that what Cobb was washing that day was soaked in fresh blood. But when asked why he hadn't reported it sooner, Wright simply shrugged. In the mountains, he said, each man minded his own business. Interfering could be fatal. Amos Wright's testimony, disturbing as it was still not enough for a formal charge. The old hermit was known for his eccentricity, and any minimally competent lawyer could discredit his words before a jury. Caldwell knew this. The law required more than the word of a man who lived alone in a cave and whom many considered half crazy. Something tangible, something undeniable was needed that would connect Elijah Cobb to the murder of Isaac Pennington. Meanwhile, the community was seething with increasing tension. People began to lock their doors at night, something that was once rare in this region, where mutual trust was part of survival. Men began to travel in groups, avoiding the more isolated trails. Martha Pennington, devastated by the loss and the brutality of the crime, demanded justice. She showed up at the sheriff's office almost daily, her eyes red from tears, asking when Cobb would be arrested, when her husband's killer would face the law. The pressure on Caldwell was immense. The county's own mayor, a man named Richard Thornton, began to question the sheriff's competence. It was rumored that if Caldwell did not solve the case soon, someone else would be appointed to the position. Worse still, conversations about taking justice into one's own hands began to emerge. Groups of men gathered in taverns, talking quietly about visiting Cobb alone, about making him confess one way or another. Caldwell knew he needed to act quickly before the situation got completely out of hand. He decided to adopt a different strategy. If he couldn't prove that Cobb had killed Isaac, perhaps he could prove it through the coins. Money left traces even in the mountains. Someone had to have seen those specific coins, had to remember some detail that could link them to Isaac Pennington. The sheriff began a meticulous investigation. He visited all the merchants within a 50-mile radius. He talked to blacksmiths, warehouse owners, street vendors. He asked about unusual transactions, about someone who had suddenly appeared with money to spend. And slowly, very slowly, an image began to form. A merchant in a town 40 miles away remembered a thin, sickly-looking man who had bought ammunition and provisions in early May, paying with old silver coins. The merchant, whose name was Marcus Sullivan, had noticed the coins because they were the kind he no longer saw often. Coins minted in 1860 from the period of the Civil War. Sullivan had kept them separate precisely because they were interesting, relics of a time that seemed increasingly distant. When Caldwell asked if Sullivan still had those coins, the trader shook his head no. He had exchanged them with an itinerant collector who had passed through the region a few weeks later, but he remembered well the man who had brought them. It perfectly matched Elijah Cobb's description. Tall, thin, sunken eyes, disheveled beard, and there was something else. The man had a recent cut on his right hand, between his thumb and forefinger, the kind of wound one receives when holding a knife that slips during a fight. This information was valuable, but still circumstantial. Caldwell needed to prove that those specific coins belonged to Isaac. He visited Martha again and asked if she could identify the money her husband was carrying. Martha thought for a long moment, then her eyes lit up with a memory. "Yes," she said. Isaac was an amateur collector of ancient coins. He had just a few 1860 coins that he kept fondly, coins he had inherited from his father, a Civil War veteran. There were 10 coins in all, and Isaac had taken them with him on the trip because he intended to show them to a possible buyer in the city where he was going. 10 coins, and Marcus Sullivan remembered receiving exactly 10 coins of that kind from Cobb. The coincidence was too great to ignore. Caldwell felt he finally had something solid, a direct connection between the murder and the suspect. But he needed more. He needed to find that roving collector who had bought Sullivan's coins. He needed to recover them to have them as physical evidence. The search for the collector took weeks. Caldwell sent telegrams to sheriffs in neighboring counties, describing the man and asking if anyone had seen him. Finally, in early July, he received a response. An antiques collector named Herbert Whitmore was in a county 100 miles away trading with local merchants. Caldwell immediately set out to find him. Whitmore was an educated man in his 50s who traveled around the region buying and selling rarities. He remembered the coins perfectly. They were excellent pieces, well preserved considering their age. He had bought them from Sullivan and still had them in his collection. When Caldwell explained the situation, Whitmore was visibly distraught. The idea that he had, even if inadvertently, benefited from a violent robbery made him uneasy. He immediately handed the coins over to the sheriff, refusing any compensation. Back in Giles County, Caldwell showed Martha the coins. She examined them with trembling hands, turning each one over, checking details that only she and Isaac knew. On one of the coins, there was a small scratch in the shape of a cross, something Isaac had accidentally done years earlier when cleaning them. Martha pointed to the scratch with her finger, then began to cry silently. They were her husband's coins. There was no doubt about it. Now, Caldwell had enough evidence. The coins stolen from Isaac had been spent by Cobb. The merchant's testimony, the description of the hand wound, Cobb's suspicious behavior throughout the period, all formed a body of evidence that any jury would find convincing. On the 15th day of July 1881, Sheriff Thomas Caldwell, accompanied by 6 armed deputies, rode to Elijah Cobb's cabin to make an arrest for murder. But when they reached the valley where the hut was hidden, they found only silence and abandonment. The door to the cabin was open, swaying gently in the wind. Inside, everything had been left behind in disarray. Clothes scattered on the floor, utensils overturned, the stove cold for days. Cobb had disappeared. Somehow, he had learned that he was about to be arrested, and he had fled deep into the mountains. The men searched the hut more carefully this time, now certain that they were looking for evidence of a murderer, and they found something they had missed in the first search. Under a loose board on the floor, there was a small hiding place. Inside, they found Isaac's leather suitcase, the same one that had been found in the forest months before. Cobb had somehow recovered it, perhaps returning to the place where he had hidden it. And there was more. A blood-stained handkerchief of the kind Isaac used, and a knife with a clean blade, but traces of red rust in the notches of the handle. It was all they needed, but the killer had escaped. Elijah Cobb was on the run in the endless Appalachian mountains, and finding him would be like searching for a ghost in an endless graveyard. Elijah Cobb's escape triggered the largest manhunt Giles County had ever witnessed. Caldwell wasted no time. That same afternoon of July 15th, he organized search parties composed of more than 30 men, experienced hunters, trackers who knew the mountains like the back of their hands, even some Civil War veterans who had learned to chase men through hostile territory. Everyone was determined to bring Cobb back, dead or alive. The mountains, however, were allies of those who fled. There were hundreds of trails, thousands of hidden valleys, caves that had never been mapped, and forests so dense that a man could be only a few feet away and remain invisible. Cobb knew that territory. He had spent years wandering the lands, hunting, exploring, learning every secret the mountains held. For him, running away was a matter of survival, and he was prepared for it. The first few days of the search were frantic but fruitless. The group scoured valleys, followed old trails, checked out abandoned huts and hunters' camps. They found footprints in some places, signs of recently extinguished fires, but they always arrived too late. Cobb moved quickly, always one step ahead of his pursuers. It was as if he could sense when they were close, disappearing at the exact moment when the men thought they would finally catch up with him. Martha Pennington offered a reward, $100, a fortune for that time and region, for anyone who brought information that led to Cobb's capture. Word spread quickly, attracting bounty hunters from neighboring counties, hardcore men accustomed to tracking down fugitives and criminals. Some came from West Virginia. Others came down from the mountains of North Carolina. Everyone wanted that money, and everyone believed they could succeed where others had failed. But as the days turned into weeks, it became clear that Cobb was smarter than anyone had imagined. He left red herrings, trails that led to nowhere. He lit fires in one valley and then moved silently to another, while pursuers wasted time searching the wrong area. He crossed streams to erase his tracks, climbed cliffs that seemed impossible, slept in trees to avoid leaving marks on the ground. There were sporadic reports of sightings. A farmer swore he had seen him near his barn one night stealing chickens. A woman in a secluded hut said a thin, creepy man had appeared on her doorstep asking for food, then disappeared into the woods when she threatened to scream. A group of loggers found the remains of a camp where someone had slept, with rabbit bones still smoldering in a barely extinguished campfire. But every time someone got close, Cobb had already evaporated like morning mist. The situation began to affect the entire region. People lived in fear, knowing that a killer was loose in the mountains around their homes. Mothers did not let their children play out of sight. Men carried guns wherever they went. At night, the roads were deserted, and even the usual tavern drunkards rushed home before complete darkness fell over the valleys. Caldwell was exhausted. He barely slept, spending his nights studying rudimentary maps of the region, trying to predict where Cobb might go, what routes he might take. The sheriff knew he couldn't allow that hunt to go on indefinitely. Each day that passed decreased the chances of capture and increased the possibility that Cobb would escape completely, perhaps crossing into another state where no one would know him. In early August, almost 3 weeks after Cobb's escape, an incident happened that changed everything. One of the bounty hunters, a man named Daniel Hartley, was tracking alone in the mountains north of the county. Hartley was known for his ability to follow tracks and for his stubbornness and never giving up on prey. He had found fresh footprints near a stream and was following them when he suddenly found himself surrounded. Cobb had prepared an ambush. He attacked Hartley from behind, knocking him to the ground before the hunter could draw his weapon. There was a violent struggle between the two men. Hartley was strong and combat savvy, but Cobb fought with the desperation of a cornered animal. They rolled down the slope, exchanging punches and blows, until finally Hartley managed to reach for his knife and strike Cobb in the left shoulder. The wound was not fatal, but it was deep enough to make Cobb retreat. He fled through the forest, leaving a trail of blood behind him. Hartley, wounded and exhausted but alive, managed to make his way back to town and report what had happened. For the first time, Cobb was injured. He would need medical help, or at least a safe place to recover. And a wounded man leaves traces that he cannot hide. Caldwell immediately reorganized the search teams. Now they had an advantage. They followed the trail of blood for miles through the mountains, each red drop on the leaves and stones a sign of hope. The trail took them to the higher regions, where the air was thinner and the vegetation sparser. It was an even more isolated territory, where only the most experienced hunters ventured. The blood led them to a rock formation on the side of a mountain, where a small cave opened like a dark mouth on the stone face. The men surrounded the entrance, guns drawn, ready for anything. Caldwell shouted into the cave, ordering Cobb to come out peacefully. There was no response, only the echo of his own voice returning from the depths of the stone. 3 men cautiously entered the cave, carrying torches to illuminate the darkness. The cave was larger than it appeared from the outside, with passageways that branched off in various directions. They explored every tunnel, every hidden chamber, expecting at any moment that Cobb would emerge from the shadows with a knife in his hand. But the cave was empty, or almost empty. In the back of one of the chambers, they found signs that someone had been there recently. There was a pile of dry twigs arranged as bedding, a few pieces of cloth stained with blood, and bones of small animals that had been eaten. On the wall of the cave, someone had scratched marks with a sharp stone, vertical lines grouped into sets of 5, as if counting the days. There were 23 marks in all, 23 days since Cobb had fled his cabin. But Cobb himself was not there. Somehow, even though he was wounded, he had realized that he was being followed and had abandoned his refuge. The trail of blood continued beyond the cave, weaker now, as if he had managed to partially stop the bleeding. The men followed him for a few more miles until the trail finally disappeared completely into a fast-moving stream running down the mountain. The stream, where the trail of blood disappeared, ran violently between the rocks, fed by the late thaw from the heights. Caldwell stood on the shore for a long time, watching the white water foam over the rocks, knowing that Cobb could have headed in either direction, upstream or downstream. Or perhaps he had simply crossed to the other side and continued through the forest, letting the water erase his tracks as he had done before. The men split again, half followed upstream, scouring the banks for any sign of an exit. The other half went down the stream, checking every bank, every confluence where Cobb might have left the water. It was slow and frustrating work. The slippery stones made every step dangerous, and the force of the current in some sections was enough to drag an inattentive man away. Meanwhile, Cobb's wound became both a curse and a possible salvation for the hunters. An injured man needed care, food, rest. He couldn't keep running indefinitely without help. Caldwell began to consider a disturbing possibility. What if Cobb had accomplices? What if there was someone in the mountains helping him escape by providing shelter and provisions? This suspicion led the sheriff to investigate Cobb's acquaintances more deeply, however few. He discovered that there was a man, a fur trapper named Nathaniel Briggs, who occasionally worked with Cobb during hunting seasons. Briggs lived in a cabin even more isolated than Cobb's, almost on the border with West Virginia. It was such a remote place that few knew of its existence. Caldwell and 4 deputies rode to Briggs's estate on a sweltering August afternoon. The heat in the mountains was oppressive, the kind of heat that makes the air tremble and turns every movement into an effort. When they arrived at Briggs's cabin, they found the man working in a makeshift open-air tannery, treating raccoon skins in a solution that smelled of death and chemicals. Nathaniel Briggs was a man in his 40s, short and stocky, with thick hands permanently stained by the tannins he used in his work. He greeted the visitors with the cautious hospitality typical of mountain dwellers, offering water from the well, but keeping his eyes alert, assessing the intentions of the lawman. Caldwell got straight to the point. He asked if Briggs had seen Cobb, if he knew his whereabouts, if he was providing help to a fugitive murderer. Briggs calmly denied everything. He said he hadn't seen Cobb in months, since before the murder. When he learned of the crime, he said he was shocked, but not surprised. He had always known that Cobb had a darkness inside him, something dangerous waiting to emerge. The deputies searched the cabin and the surrounding area, while Caldwell continued to interrogate Briggs. They found nothing suspicious, no sign that anyone else had been there recently, no extra provisions to suggest that Briggs was feeding a fugitive. But there was something about Briggs's behavior that bothered Caldwell, a subtle tension, a glance that occasionally drifted to the mountains to the east, as if checking something that only he could see. Before leaving, Caldwell warned Briggs that anyone who helped Cobb would be considered an accomplice to murder and would face justice just as harshly. Briggs nodded solemnly, vowing that if he saw the fugitive, he would immediately report it to the authorities. But as the lawman walked away, Caldwell looked back one last time and saw Briggs standing in the doorway of his cabin, watching them leave with an expression that was hard to decipher. Was it fear or something more complex? That night, Caldwell decided to do something risky. He left a deputy hidden in the mountains near Briggs's property, with instructions to watch for any suspicious movement. The deputy, a young man named Robert Hayes, only 24 years old, but experienced in tracking, camped on an elevated spot from which he could see the cabin without being seen. He would wait there for as many days as necessary. 3 nights passed with nothing. Hayes was beginning to question whether his vigil had any purpose, when on the 4th night he saw something that made his heart race. A small, dim light moving through the woods toward Briggs's cabin. It was not an ordinary torch, but something smaller, perhaps a covered lantern to minimize glare. Someone was sneaking up to the cabin in the middle of the night. Hayes watched as the light reached the cabin. The door opened before anyone even knocked, as if Briggs were waiting. The light went in quickly and the door closed. Hayes couldn't see who the night visitor was, but his instinct told him he had found something important. He waited there, motionless, barely breathing, watching the dimly lit cabin from within. It was 2 hours before the door opened again. The same faint light emerged, and Hayes was finally able to see through the night mist and into the distance the silhouette of a tall, thin man. Even from afar, even in almost complete darkness, there was something unmistakable about that shape. The way he moved, stealthy but wounded, favoring the left side of his body. It was Cobb. It had to be Cobb. Hayes knew he was alone, and that facing a desperate killer in the darkness would be suicide. His mission was to observe and report. He waited until the light completely disappeared into the forest, then quietly descended from his observation post. It would take a few hours to reach the town and inform Caldwell. But now they knew Briggs was helping Cobb, and the fugitive was still in the region, returning periodically to seek provisions or medical care. At dawn, Caldwell had assembled his best men. They returned to Briggs's property, this time without warning, surrounding the cabin before the sun fully rose. When Briggs opened the door in the morning, he found 6 rifles pointed at him. The expression of surprise and fear on his face was quickly replaced by resignation. He knew he had been discovered. Under cross-examination, Briggs initially tried to stand by his story, but the evidence from Hayes' testimony was too much. Finally, he collapsed. He admitted that Cobb had shown up at his door 2 weeks earlier, hurt and desperate. Briggs said he didn't want to help, that he knew it was wrong, but Cobb had threatened him. He said he would kill Briggs and his family if he did not provide food and temporary shelter. Caldwell did not completely believe the story of the threats. There was something else there. Maybe an old loyalty. Maybe Cobb was paying Briggs with some of the money stolen from Isaac. But motivation mattered less than the crucial information Briggs finally revealed. Cobb was hiding in an old hunter's hut about 12 kilometers away on the highest slopes of the mountain. It was a place that few knew, built decades earlier and long abandoned. Briggs drew a crude map showing how to get there. The path was treacherous, winding through narrow trails and past areas where a rock slide could easily kill a man, but it was also a place from which it would be difficult to escape quickly. If they surrounded the cabin properly, Cobb would have nowhere to run. The operation was planned with meticulous care. Caldwell couldn't risk another failure, couldn't allow Cobb to escape again. He assembled 12 men, chosen not only for their courage, but for their knowledge of the mountains and their ability to move silently through difficult terrain. They would leave before dawn, reach the cabin area at noon, and surround the place before making any moves. Briggs was forced to accompany them as a guide, his hands tied to his horse's saddle. He protested, claiming that Cobb would kill him if he discovered the betrayal. But Caldwell was adamant. If Briggs was telling the truth about Cobb's whereabouts, he would help capture him. If he were lying, he would be the first to face the consequences. The journey began at 4 in the morning of August 27th, when darkness still covered the valleys like a heavy blanket. The men rode in silence, only the sound of the horses' hooves on the rocks breaking the stillness of the night. As they rose, the temperature dropped. The altitude brought a chill that penetrated to the bone. Even in summer, fog formed around them, turning the trees into gray specters that appeared and disappeared like ghosts. Around 10 o'clock, they had to abandon their horses. The terrain had become too steep with loose rocks and fallen logs blocking any passage for large animals. From there, they would continue on foot, carrying only their weapons, water, and minimal provisions. Briggs led them along a path that looked more like a scar on the side of the mountain, so narrow at points that they had to advance sideways, their backs against the rock and the chasm ahead. It was during one of these narrow passages that one of the deputies, a man named Samuel Norton, slipped. His foot found a loose stone, and for a terrible moment, he began to fall. His hands desperately grasped the rock as his legs hung over the void. 2 men held him back, pulling him back tightly until he was safe again, trembling and pale. After that, everyone moved even slower, testing each stone before putting their full weight on it. At noon, Briggs signaled that they were near. He pointed to an elevation ahead, where ancient trees grew dense around a rock formation. The hut, he said, was hidden among those rocks and trees, built so that it was practically invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. It was the perfect hiding place, and that's probably why it had survived intact for so many years. Caldwell divided his men into 3 groups. 4 men would surround the hut from the north, 4 from the south, and he himself would lead 4 men on a direct approach from the east. Briggs would be tied to a tree, far enough away not to interfere, but close enough to be used as bait if necessary. The groups would split up and take their positions silently, communicating only by signs. When everyone was ready, Caldwell would give the command to move forward. The approach took more than an hour. Each man moved like a hunter chasing a deer, placing his feet carefully so as not to break branches or make the dry leaves creak. Sweat ran down their foreheads despite the cold of the altitude. The tension was palpable. Each man knowing that Cobb was dangerous, and that cornered, he could fight with the ferocity of a wild animal. Finally, through the trees, Caldwell saw the cabin. Briggs was right. It was almost invisible, built against a rock face and covered by decades of plant growth. The roof was covered with moss, and small plants had rooted between the planks of the walls. It seemed abandoned, dead, but a thin trail of smoke rising from a crude chimney revealed that someone was inside. Caldwell waited until he could see the signs from the other groups, indicating that they were in position. Then, slowly, he and his men moved forward. They were only 20 yards from the hut when the door suddenly opened. Elijah Cobb appeared on the threshold, holding an old but functional rifle. His left shoulder was bandaged with dirty rags, stained with dried blood. He was thinner than before, his face scarred by weeks of flight and fear, but his eyes still shone with that same dangerous darkness. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if time had stopped in that clearing on the heights of the mountains. Cobb looked around slowly, seeing the armed men emerging from the trees on all sides. He realized that he was surrounded, that there was no escape route this time. A strange expression flashed across his face. It wasn't fear, exactly, but something close to resignation mixed with a deep old anger. Caldwell stepped forward, keeping his own rifle pointed at Cobb. His voice, when he spoke, was firm without a trace of emotion. He told Cobb that he was under arrest for the murder of Isaac Pennington, that he should drop his weapon and surrender peacefully, that he would have his trial before the law and the chance to present his defense. Everything would be done according to the rules of civilized justice. Cobb spat on the floor. When he spoke, his voice was heavy from weeks of talking only to himself. He said he would not surrender, that he would rather die there in those mountains he knew so well than swing on a rope in front of a crowd in the city. He said that Isaac Pennington had been a fool carrying money as if the mountains were safe, that he, Cobb, had only done what was natural, what the mountains themselves taught. The strong survive, the weak perish. It was a confession, cold, unapologetic, but a confession. All the men there heard it. But before Caldwell could respond, before anyone could react, Cobb raised his rifle. He did not point it at any of the men, but at the sky. He fired once, the sound echoing through the mountains like thunder. Then, with a quick, desperate movement, he rushed back into the hut and slammed the door. Caldwell's men immediately scattered, seeking cover behind trees and rocks. Shouts were exchanged, orders given, but everyone knew that the situation had changed drastically. Cobb was armed, entrenched, and apparently prepared to die fighting. The hut, built against the rock, had only one visible entrance. To attempt to break in would be to expose the men to Cobb's fire, risking multiple deaths. Caldwell shouted at Cobb, saying that he was surrounded, that there was no escape, that if he surrendered now, he would be treated fairly. But the only response was another shot, this time through a crack between the planks of the wall. The bullet whistled close to the head of one of the deputies, causing him to dive behind a rock. An impasse had been established, Cobb inside the cabin, the lawmen outside. The afternoon dragged on, the sun beginning its descent towards the horizon. Caldwell knew they couldn't just wait. The night in the mountains was treacherous, and trying to maintain a siege in the darkness would be almost impossible. Cobb could try to escape under cover of night, and in the shadows, his chances of success would increase dramatically. Caldwell's decision was pragmatic and ruthless. If Cobb would not leave voluntarily, then he would be forced to leave. The sheriff ordered 2 men to pick up dry twigs and flammable materials from the surrounding forest. The idea was clear to everyone. Smoke would fill the cabin quickly, and Cobb would have to choose between suffocating to death or facing the rifles waiting outside. It was not ideal justice. It was not the orderly judgment that the law prescribed. But in the mountains, far from the courts and civilization, the law assumed more primitive forms. The men worked quickly, piling dry wood against the north wall of the hut, the far side of the entrance. They used pine branches that still had resin, knowing they would burn fast and produce dense smoke. Caldwell gave Cobb one last chance, shouting across the clearing that he had 5 minutes to come out with his hands raised. Otherwise, the cabin would be set on fire. No answer came from within, only heavy silence, interrupted occasionally by the wind that whistled between the ancient trees. The men waited, mentally counting the minutes that passed with the cruel slowness of drops of resin descending a log. When the 5 minutes were up and Cobb remained silent, Caldwell nodded. One of the men struck a match and brought it close to the dry branches. The fire spread quickly, licking the old wood of the hut with hungry orange tongues. The smoke began to rise in thick, dark columns, first slowly, then in dense clouds that enveloped the entire structure. The heat was intense, even 20 meters away. The old planks of the hut, dried out by decades of neglect, caught fire with frightening ease. In a matter of minutes, the entire north side was engulfed in flames. Inside the cabin, Cobb faced an impossible choice. The smoke was already invading every corner of the single room, burning his lungs and blurring his vision. The heat grew, turning his refuge into an oven. He could hear the crackling of the flames consuming the wood, feel the ground warming under his feet. The walls began to crack, and through the cracks, he saw the orange glow of the hell they had created around him. He tried to plug the cracks with rags and clothes, tried to protect himself from the smoke by covering his face, but it was useless. The entire cabin was turning into a funeral pyre. Cobb knew he had only minutes before the roof collapsed on him, or the smoke completely overcame him. His options had been reduced to two: burn to death like a trapped animal, or go out and face the rifles of the men who were waiting for him. Outside, Caldwell's men held their positions, rifles at the ready, eyes fixed on the cabin door. The heat was so intense now that they had to retreat even further. The flames had consumed nearly half of the structure, and the roar of the fire was deafening. Some were beginning to think that Cobb had chosen to die inside, that he had preferred the flames to the executioner's rope. But then the door opened violently. Cobb emerged, staggering, coughing desperately, his eyes red and watering from smoke. He still held his rifle, but his hands trembled. For a moment it seemed that he would try to shoot, that he would force the men to kill him right then and there. But then something in him broke. The rifle fell from his hands, and he collapsed to his knees on the ground, coughing and choking, defeated at last, not by the law of men, but by the fire that had made his position untenable. The deputies moved quickly. Two of them grabbed him by the arms, pulling him away from the burning hut before it collapsed completely. Another tied his hands with thick rope, tightening the knots with unnecessary force, all the anger and frustration of weeks of hunting being unloaded in those simple gestures. Cobb couldn't resist. He kept coughing, spitting smoke and ash, his body trembling with exhaustion and defeat. Caldwell stood there, watching for a long moment. The hut was now just a structure of flames, the walls collapsing one after the other in bursts of sparks that rose into the sky like falling stars in reverse. Cobb's entire hideout, his last refuge in the mountains he knew so well, was being reduced to ashes and memories. It was as if the mountains themselves were rejecting him, expelling him from their embrace. They couldn't go down the mountain that night. The path was too dangerous to navigate in the darkness, especially carrying a prisoner. They camped at a safe distance from the still smoking hut, keeping guards taking turns throughout the night. Cobb was tied to a thick tree, his hands bound so that he could not reach the knots. They didn't give him food, only water, and he drank greedily, still trying to clear the smoke from his throat. During the night, while the others slept in shifts, Caldwell stayed awake, watching the prisoner. Cobb sat with his back against the tree, looking up at the starry sky that appeared between the treetops. There was no more challenge in his eyes, just a kind of deep tiredness. The sheriff wondered what was going through the man's mind, if there was remorse for what he had done to Isaac Pennington, or if he felt only the bitterness of capture. Finally, he broke the silence and asked directly, "Why, Isaac? Why kill an innocent man for just a few coins?" Cobb was silent for so long that Caldwell thought he would not respond. But then, his voice still hoarse from the smoke, he began to speak. He said he had seen Isaac that morning, walking alone along the trails with his leather suitcase. He said that there was something in that scene that had irritated him deeply. A confident, well-dressed man carrying possessions as if the mountains were safe for him. Cobb talked about how he had followed Isaac for hours, watching from afar, struggling with dark thoughts. He said that he had not planned to kill him initially, that he just wanted to see where he went. But then, when Isaac stopped to rest in that secluded clearing, when he took out his coins to count them in the sunlight, something in him snapped. The envy, the anger, the resentment accumulated by years of hard life in the mountains, while others seemed to have it all with ease. All of this exploded at once. The fight was brutal and fast. Isaac had tried to defend himself, but Cobb was stronger, more desperate. When he finished, and Isaac lay dead in the blood-stained earth, Cobb said he had felt not remorse, but a kind of frightening emptiness. He took the coins because they were valuable, hid the suitcase because it could be recognized, dragged the body to the stream because he didn't want it to be found. But each of these actions was mechanical, without real thought. It was as if someone else was controlling his movements. Caldwell listened to it all in silence. It wasn't quite a confession in the legal sense, but it was close enough, and it revealed something about the nature of the crime that made him uneasy. It had not been an elaborate murder. It had not been the work of a professional criminal. It had been the impulsive act of an embittered man who had let his inner darkness gain control. In a way, this made it even more tragic. Isaac Pennington had died, not because he had done anything wrong, but simply because he had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, crossing the path of a man whose shadows had finally consumed him. At dawn, they began their descent. They took Cobb along the same treacherous trails they had climbed, now with the added weight of a prisoner, whose movements had to be constantly watched. The return journey took almost the entire day. When they finally reached the city at dusk, a crowd had already gathered. News of the capture had spread faster than they could travel, carried by messengers on horseback who rushed ahead. Martha Pennington was among the crowd. When she saw Cobb being brought in tied up, her face changed. It was not just pain or anger that was seen there, but something more complex. The sight of the man who had taken her husband from her, now captured and defeated, did not bring the relief she had imagined. It just made the loss more real, more final. Isaac would never come back no matter what happened to Cobb. Giles County Jail was a small, damp structure built of heavy stones and wrought iron bars that had rusted over the years. It had only 4 cells, rarely all occupied at the same time. Serious crime was uncommon in that region, where most problems were resolved between neighbors without law enforcement involvement. But now, for the first time in years, the prison housed a man accused of murder, and the entire community seemed to breathe in the tension that came with it. Cobb was placed in the most secure cell, the one at the end of the hall, away from windows and natural light. 2 guards were assigned to guard the prison day and night, taking turns in 12-hour shifts. Caldwell did not trust that Cobb would not try to escape, even though he was trapped behind thick iron bars. There was something about this man, an almost animal-like quality of survival, that made the sheriff remain vigilant even after capture. Preparations for the trial began immediately. A judge would need to be brought in from the state capitol, a man named the Honorable Marcus Whitfield, known for his severity and his strict interpretation of the law. He was scheduled to arrive 2 weeks after Cobb's arrest. Meanwhile, Caldwell organized all the evidence, prepared the witnesses, ensured that every detail of the case was properly documented. The evidence was substantial. The recovered coins that Martha had identified as belonging to Isaac, Marcus Sullivan's testimony about the transaction with Cobb, Isaac's belongings found hidden in Cobb's cabin, Amos Wright's account of seeing Cobb washing bloody clothes, and more importantly, the confession Cobb had made on the mountain, heard by a dozen witnesses. It was a strong case, perhaps the strongest Caldwell had ever built in his career. But something happened during those 2 weeks of waiting that no one had anticipated. The community, which had initially been crying out for swift and severe justice, began to split. Some even demanded that Cobb be hanged, that he pay with his life for the life he had taken. But others, especially those who lived in the mountains and knew the harshness of that existence, began to express something close to understanding. Not forgiveness, but a dark understanding of how a man could be led to do terrible things. In taverns, whispered conversations debated the nature of justice. An old hunter remarked that everyone in the mountains lived near the edge between civilization and savagery, that the line was thinner than the town's people liked to admit. Another talked about how poverty and isolation could eat away at a man's soul, turning him into something he never intended to be. They were not excuses, they always emphasized, but they were explanations that made the horror a little more understandable. Martha Pennington did not participate in these conversations. She remained isolated in her home, receiving only visits from close family members and the pastor of the local church. The pastor, Reverend Jonathan Miller, tried to offer comfort through the scriptures, talking about forgiveness and leaving justice in God's hands. But Martha didn't want to hear about forgiveness. She just wanted it all to be over, for Cobb to be tried and punished so that she could finally start trying to rebuild a life without Isaac. The day of judgment came on the 14th of September in the year 1881. The makeshift courthouse was set up in the community hall, the only space large enough to accommodate all the people who wanted to watch. Chairs were arranged in rows. One table was set for the judge, another for the prosecutor and the defense. There was nothing grand there, and none of the trappings of the great courts of the cities. It was rural justice at its most basic, but no less serious because of it. Judge Whitfield was a tall, thin man in his 60s, with white hair and eyes that seemed to penetrate through the lies to the truth. He had presided over dozens of trials throughout his career and had a reputation for being fair but uncompromising. When he entered the hall, everyone rose in respect, and a heavy silence fell over the assembly. Cobb was brought in chains, flanked by 2 armed guards. He looked different now. He had been allowed to bathe and given clean clothes, but there was something broken in his posture that had not existed before. His shoulders were hunched, his head bowed. When he looked at the crowd, his eyes quickly averted, unable to find the accusatory looks that awaited him. A lawyer had been assigned to defend Cobb. It was a young graduate named Edward Morrison, who had arrived in the county just a few months earlier, trying to establish a practice. He didn't want the case, but the law required that even a confessed murderer have representation. Morrison was competent, but realistic. He knew there was no real defense for what Cobb had done. His only hope was to argue for extenuating circumstances, perhaps to avoid the death penalty in favor of life imprisonment. The prosecutor was the county's own district attorney, a seasoned man named Harold Simmons. Simmons was 45 years old and had prosecuted many cases throughout his career, but never a murder as clear as this one. He opened the case with a meticulous reconstruction of the events. He described Isaac Pennington as an honest and hard-working man, a devoted husband who was simply trying to resolve family issues when he was brutally murdered. Witness after witness was called. Martha Pennington climbed onto the stand and identified the coins through silent tears. Marcus Sullivan described the transaction with Cobb. Daniel Hartley recounted his violent encounter in the mountains. Amos Wright, trembling with nervousness from being in such a formal setting, told of seeing Cobb washing his bloody clothes. And finally, Caldwell and his deputies testified about the confession Cobb had made the night after his capture. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable. Even Morrison, doing his best to defend his client, had to admit internally that there was no real hope. During cross-examination, he attempted to establish that Cobb had diminished mental capacity, that years of isolation in the mountains had affected his judgment. He brought in witnesses who spoke about Cobb's strange behavior, about his reputation for being mentally unstable, but all of this seemed weak in the face of the weight of evidence of the crime itself. The most dramatic moment came when Morrison asked for permission for Cobb to testify in his own defense. It was risky, and everyone knew it. But Cobb had insisted. He wanted to talk. He wanted people to hear his version, even though he knew he probably wouldn't change anything. Judge Whitfield granted permission, and Cobb was taken to the stand. He spoke for almost an hour. His voice was low but clear, and he didn't try to deny what he had done. Instead, he talked about his life, about how he had arrived in the mountains years before, fleeing from a past that he never fully detailed, about how isolation had changed him, how lonely winters and empty summers had dug something inside him. He talked about seeing other men with families with purpose, while he had only loneliness and the constant struggle for survival. When he reached the day of the murder, his voice trembled for the first time. He said he couldn't fully explain what had happened to him when he saw Isaac. It was as if all the frustrations, all the bitterness of years had boiled over and overflowed at once. He had not planned to kill Isaac, but when he started, he couldn't stop. And then, when it was all over, and he looked back at what he had done, it was too late to turn back. The silence that followed Cobb's testimony was as thick as the morning mist in the mountains. No one in the room moved. Even those who had arrived with a thirst for revenge seemed shaken by the crudeness and honesty of those words. There was no excuse in what Cobb had said, just a naked confession of how darkness can grow inside a man until there is nothing left but it. Judge Whitfield observed Cobb for a long moment before dismissing him back to the dock. The closing arguments were brief. Simmons presented the case with surgical clarity. An innocent man had been brutally murdered. The murderer had confessed. Justice demanded appropriate punishment. Morrison, for his part, made an emotional plea for mercy. He argued that Cobb was the product of circumstances that had destroyed him even before he destroyed another. That hanging a man already broken by life would not bring Isaac back or make the world safer. He asked the jury to consider life imprisonment instead of capital punishment. The jury, composed of 12 men from the county, retired to deliberate. The wait was agonizing. Martha remained seated in the front row, her hands clasped so tight that her fingers turned white. Caldwell stood by the door, watching the crowd, ready to intervene if emotions boiled over. The hours dragged on as outside the sun completed its journey across the sky, tinting the distant mountains with shades of orange and red. When the jury finally returned, it was almost 6 in the afternoon. The foreman, a respected farmer named Thomas Harrison, carried a folded paper in his hands. Judge Whitfield asked if they had reached a verdict. Harrison nodded, his voice firm as he spoke. Guilty of first-degree murder. The decision was unanimous. There was no doubt in the minds of any of the 12 men about Elijah Cobb's guilt. What came next was expected, but still solemn. Judge Whitfield asked Cobb to stand up to hear his sentence. The killer rose slowly, the chains on his wrists jingling in the absolute silence of the hall. Whitfield spoke with the authority of decades serving the law. He said that the crime committed by Cobb was among the most serious that one man could commit against another. That Isaac Pennington deserved to live, deserved to complete his journey, deserved to return to his wife, and that this life was taken not out of necessity or defense, but through greed and cruel violence. The sentence was death by hanging. He would be executed on the 1st of October of 1881, exactly 17 days after the trial, enough time for Cobb to make peace with his fate and any God he believed in. When the words were spoken, Cobb did not react. He simply nodded slightly, as if he were accepting something he had always known would come. The guards carried him back to the prison as the crowd began to disperse in silence. Those final 17 days were strange for everyone involved. Cobb received visits from Reverend Miller, who spent hours trying to bring spiritual comfort to the condemned man. Their conversations remained private, but the Reverend would later say that Cobb had expressed genuine remorse for what he had done, that he understood that he deserved to die, that he did not ask for forgiveness because he knew he did not deserve it. He only hoped that his death would bring some measure of peace to Martha and the community he had traumatized. Martha visited the prison only once, 3 days before the execution. No one knows exactly what was said between her and the man who killed her husband. The guard stepped aside for privacy, and when she emerged 20 minutes later, her face was marked by tears, but also by something that could be described as a quiet resolution. She never spoke publicly about that conversation, taking her words and Cobb's to the grave decades later. The morning of the 1st of October dawned clear and cold. Autumn began to paint the mountains with colors of fire and gold. A gallows had been erected in the town's central square, a simple but efficient structure that had been used only twice before in the county's history. A sizable crowd gathered, though smaller than many expected. Some couldn't face the thought of watching a man die, no matter how deserved his punishment. Cobb was brought out of jail at 9 in the morning. He had refused a hood, saying he wanted to see the mountains one last time. As he was positioned over the trapdoor, with the rope already adjusted around his neck, he looked out over the distant elevations that had been his home and his prison for so many years. His last words were simple and addressed to no one in particular. He said that the mountains had given him everything and taken everything, and that now he was giving them back the only thing he had left, his life. Sheriff Caldwell, doing his duty to the end, pulled the lever. The trapdoor opened with a dry sound of wood against wood. Elijah Cobb fell, and the rope tightened with a final crack. His death was quick, at least. In a few minutes, it was all over. The man who had murdered Isaac Pennington, who had fled over the mountains like a wild animal, who had confessed his darkness without excuse, was no more, just a body swaying gently in the cold morning wind. He was buried in a secluded part of the county cemetery, far from the respectable graves of decent people. No tombstone marked the site, just a simple wooden cross with his initials. In time, even that cross would disappear, rotting and being covered by growing vegetation, until no one else knew exactly where Elijah Cobb had been laid to rest. Martha Pennington never remarried. She lived alone on the property she had shared with Isaac, maintaining it with the help of neighbors and family. She died in 1927 at the age of 73 and was buried next to her husband. Her tombstone had only her name and the dates of birth and death. It did not mention the tragedy that had defined much of her life. Some pains are too deep to be inscribed in stone. Isaac Pennington's case has remained in the memory of Giles County for generations. People told the story on cold winter nights, a grim reminder that civilization was always a thin layer on top of something more primitive and dangerous. The mountains continued to keep their secrets, silent witnesses of human tragedies that repeated themselves in different forms over the years. Today, more than a century later, few remember the names involved. The cabin where Cobb hid disappeared completely, consumed by flames and then time. The trails Isaac traveled on his last journey have been replaced by modern roads. But if you walk through the higher regions of Virginia's Appalachian mountains, where ancient trees still grow dense and the morning mist still turns everything into mystery, you can feel the echo of those dark 1881 days. Isaac Pennington's story reminds us that justice, no matter how hard we try to make it civilized and orderly, sometimes emerges from dark and violent places, that good men can die for nothing but bad luck and random cruelty, and that the mountains, beautiful and terrible as they have always been, remain silent witnesses to all the secrets that humans carry to their depths. If this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in American history has touched you in any way, consider subscribing to our channel for more stories that explore the dark corners of the past. Leave a comment telling us what you think of this case, and if there are any other historical mysteries you'd like us to investigate. Until the next story, stay safe and remember that sometimes the truth is darker than any fiction we can imagine.